UFC 200.
Yeah.
Arguably the landmark event in the history of the UFC. We lose our main event the Wednesday before UFC 200. Millions, if not tens of millions, into the marketing of that. The success of the pay-per-view probably hinges on that great main event between Jon and Daniel. And we lost it 3 or 4 days before, and that could happen at any given moment.
Now, we talked about this before the podcast, what you could or could not talk about with the current state of Jon Jones' investigation. So where's it at right now?
Yeah, so, generally we don't talk about a case. So how the process works, when an athlete tests positive, USADA will notify me. I usually pick the phone up right away and call Dana and let him know. And the UFC puts out an announcement. They say, in the case of Jon tested positive in an in-competition test on this date. More information will be provided at the appropriate time. And that's generally all we'll talk about. Now, if the athlete chooses to talk about, scenarios of what happened, then they're free to do that. At that point, USADA and the UFC can comment on it. So there's been some things talked about in the Jon case by Jon. Particularly, he had 2 clean tests on July 7th and July 8th before his positive test on, I think, July 30th, which was weigh-in day. And the positive test was for dihydrochloromethyltestosterone, or oral turinabol. This is a substance that was used by the East Germans regularly in the late 60s, and then came into the fold a little bit more of what's come out recently out of Russia. So I know you had Brian Fogel on for the Icarus movie. I think he talked about a little bit about this. Gregory, the head of the Moscow WADA laboratory, that this drug became kind of part of his protocol with his athletes. He then, ironically enough, developed a test for the long-term metabolites of the drug. So previous to that, the detection window of this drug was a couple of days. So it was a drug that, even if you run a strict program, an athlete may gamble with taking because it had a quick clearance time. After he discovered the long-term metabolite test, that changed. It went from a detection window of a couple days to a detection window of several months. And this was widely known. It wasn't a secret. Initially, they kept it quiet. They went back and retested some samples, and there was a whole, bunch of positives. And then it got out 2013 around that there was this new test. So right up front, I've said this a while now, would not make a lot of sense for an individual, a UFC athlete that knew, especially, a champion contender like Jon Jones that knew, hey, I'm tested quite regularly in this program, would not make a lot of sense that would be your drug of choice if you were intentionally trying to cheat. I think it's come out after the fact that USADA did another test on Jon a month or two or a couple months after his positive test, and he was negative during that test. So that would be indicative that, the prohibited system entered his system, or the prohibited substance entered his system, sometime after July 7th or 8th, and was likely, a pretty small amount, and that it cleared his system pretty quickly. Again, who knows where it plays out, but certainly on the surface of things, I have said, at this point in the game, with that type of information out there, it wouldn't indicate intentional use. Now, that could be wrong. I don't know that definitively, and we'll see how this plays out. Right now, where the process is Jon and USADA are working closely. I'm aware that there was a meeting a week or two ago, a pretty lengthy meeting, which I was told was productive. I wasn't given details of what productive meant, but I think that's an important thing right now, and that Jon's following through with is to retrace all of his steps between that, last July 8th positive test or negative test and the positive test on July 29th or July 30th.
It certainly seems like, based on what you just said, that this is something that was accidentally taken. But if you can't prove that something was accidentally taken, like if you can't nail it down, what happens there?
Yeah, it's difficult, and that's kind of the nightmare scenario that a lot of that an athlete can face, and a big role of what Don and I do to prevent that from happening, to show them what type of care and consideration is needed to make sure you don't get into a scenario like that. under a program like this, you have to be careful about everything that's put into your body, everything. And if you're not, there can be, severe consequences. So yeah, we'll see where this plays out. I tell you the one thing that I can say about this is, this is obviously Jon's second time in the program with testing positive, and the first time he went through a pretty lengthy appeal process, and there was a publicly issued decision, 50, 60 pages, that went through all the evidence that the independent arbitrators heard and decided on. And what they said definitively in that case was there was no evidence that Jon intentionally cheated. However, he operated with careless, reckless disregard. So he ended up getting the maximum for those substances he tested positive for a year.
And that was for some gas station Viagra type shit.
It was actually a couple of anti-estrogen drugs, but what was shown and what the evidence pointed to was that he took a pill that was manufactured from a website by the name of All American Peptide. The pill was purported to be a Cialis pill, so an erectile dysfunction pill that was tainted with these two drugs. Now, the problem, what the arbitrator said, is if he would have gone to that website, and the arbitrators did and I did, you would have seen that same website offered, tons of prohibited performance-enhancing drugs. And the website said, not for human consumption, for research purposes only. So it really was careless disregard. That being said, however, Jon's, second time through the program now, the second sanction, this time for, an anabolic type steroid, would have, a starting point potentially of a 4-year suspension.
That's a starting point.
That could be a starting point, right? And unless there are mitigating factors. Now, I don't, again, the beauty of this program is it's not the UFC or not me deciding, what the sanction's going to be. No one can accuse us of, operating for business purposes or favoritism or whatever. Right. But that being said, when we put this program together and figured out, what sanctioning would look like, I don't necessarily think that we put up a 4-year sanction for a second-term offense when the first-term offense was shown that person didn't cheat intentionally, just operated with careless disregard.
So who makes that distinction then? USADA?
USADA makes that distinction. They have a whole team looking at it. They compare it to other cases under, the WADA Olympic-type umbrella, similar cases. I will say this, that, I think we've had a few over 60 positive adverse events in this case, and those that have been adjudicated, I've been comfortable every time that they've made a fair and balanced and reasonable decision. And that's part of my job, is to be the eyes and ears for athletes, to make sure not only is the program being administered properly and has strength, but also that they're being treated fairly and that they have due process. So I have all the confidence in the world, however this does come out, that it will be the right decision. The other really cool thing about the program is the transparency of the program. So, it won't just be me saying this. However it does come out, whether it goes to arbitration or whether Jon and USADA reach a settlement, it'll be well spelled out about why that sanction was determined.
Now, you say starting point, meaning that it could potentially be more?
It could. So when there's something called aggravating circumstances, so more than just knowingly taking the drug, taking the drug and lying, trying to cover it up, taking multiple drugs, one trying to hide the other, you could get double the sanction amount. So, on a second time anabolic steroid, 4 years is kind of the starting point. You can go lower for mitigating factors. You can go higher for aggravating factors, up to 8 years. It would have to require something, really severe and egregious to get up that high.